The spring evening air carried the scent of rain as Miss Georgiana Fairfax stepped from her family's carriage onto the cobblestones of Belgrave Square, her hand trembling slightly as she accepted her father's arm and forced herself to breathe slowly through the tightness in her chest that had become her constant companion these past months. Lady Hertford's mansion blazed before them like a temple of judgment, every window ablaze with candlelight that spilled onto the street, where dozens of carriages queued to deliver London's most distinguished families to what everyone agreed was the season's most important ball. And Georgiana knew with a certainty that made her stomach clench that tonight would likely decide the rest of her life. Lord Fairfax squeezed her elbow gently, the gesture meant to be reassuring, but only reminding her of how much thinner he had become since the railway investments had failed, how the lines around his eyes had deepened with worry he tried to hide from her, and she straightened her spine and lifted her chin because she would not add to his burdens by showing her own fear. Her gown of ivory silk with delicate rose embroidery had cost more than they could afford, one final extravagance her father had insisted upon, saying his daughter would not enter the marriage market looking like a pauper even if they were dangerously close to becoming exactly that. And as they climbed the marble steps between towering columns, she caught sight of her reflection in the great glass doors and barely recognized the poised young woman in expensive silk, her chestnut hair arranged in an elaborate style that had taken her maid 2 hours to perfect, her face carefully composed into an expression of serene pleasantness that revealed nothing of the desperation churning beneath. The butler announced them in ringing tones that carried across the entrance hall, and Georgiana felt the familiar weight of eyes turning toward them, assessing, calculating, determining their worth with the cold precision of merchants at market, and she knew what they saw, a once prominent family now teetering on the edge of ruin, a daughter of good breeding and adequate looks, whose primary value lay in her willingness to accept a match that would restore her family's fortunes, regardless of her own feelings on the matter. Lord Edmund Whitmore materialized at her side almost before they had cleared the receiving line, his broad face flushed with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed himself generous for courting a woman beneath his financial status, and he bowed over her hand with proprietary confidence that made her skin prickle with instinctive resistance she had no right to indulge. "I have been counting the minutes until your arrival, Miss Fairfax," he declared, loud enough for those nearby to hear, his fingers lingering on hers longer than necessary as he smiled at her father with the expression of a man who had already closed a business deal and was merely waiting for the papers to be signed. Lord Fairfax returned the smile with visible relief because Edmund Whitmore represented salvation, a wealthy viscount whose income from northern coal mines would not only rescue them from debt, but restore their social position. And it did not matter that Edmund spoke to Georgiana as if she were a promising horse he intended to purchase, or that his idea of courtship consisted of lengthy monologues about his own importance, punctuated by perfunctory inquiries into her needlework. They entered the ballroom, and Georgiana's breath caught despite everything, because Lady Hertford had transformed the enormous space into something from a fairy tale, thousands of candles blazing in crystal chandeliers that cast dancing light across floor-to-ceiling mirrors, multiplying the crowd of 400 guests in their finest silks and jewels into what seemed like thousands, an endless sea of wealth and privilege that she was meant to join permanently through marriage to a man she could barely tolerate. The orchestra played from the mezzanine level, the sweet strains of a waltz floating down over the crowd, and through the French doors that stood open to the gardens she could see couples stealing moments of relative privacy beneath the moonlight, their shadows merging in ways that made her chest ache with longing for something she had no name for and no right to want. Edmund was speaking again, something about his newest carriage, or perhaps his London house. She had stopped listening as she scanned the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who had attended these events since she was 17 and had learned to read the subtle hierarchies and shifting alliances that governed their world, noting which families stood together and which maintained careful distance, which young ladies had secured the attention of eligible gentlemen, and which stood with the slightly desperate brightness of those running out of time. Then her gaze snagged on a figure standing alone near the terrace doors, slightly apart from the crowd, and her heart performed an odd little skip that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with the dark-haired man whose very stillness seemed to command attention more effectively than movement ever could. Sebastian Wentworth, the Duke of Ashford, was watching her with an intensity that made heat rise to her cheeks, his grey eyes fixed on her face with a focus that felt almost physical, and for a moment the crowded ballroom seemed to fall away until there was only that steady gaze that saw her in a way no one had looked at her in longer than she could remember. She had never been formally introduced to the Duke, though of course she knew who he was. Everyone did. The most desired bachelor in England, who had rejected every matrimonial scheme for 7 years with such consistent coldness that mothers had stopped throwing their daughters at him and started warning them that the Duke of Ashford had ice where his heart should be. He was taller than most men in the room, his dark evening clothes perfectly tailored to emphasize broad shoulders and a lean athletic build, his features aristocratic and severe, with high cheekbones and a firm mouth that looked unused to smiling. And there was something in his bearing that suggested coiled tension, a man holding himself in rigid check for reasons Georgiana could not begin to guess. Edmund's hand closed on her arm, drawing her attention back with the subtle pressure of ownership, and when she glanced back toward the terrace doors, the Duke was still watching her, but now his jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly as Edmund steered her toward the dance floor with the confident assumption that her card belonged to him by right. The first dance was a country reel that required concentration, giving Georgiana an excuse not to respond to Edmund's running commentary on the various guests, their fortunes, their scandals, their weaknesses that he catalogued with the glee of someone who enjoyed feeling superior. And she smiled and nodded and tried not to notice that the Duke had moved to a position where he could observe the dancers, his expression unreadable, but his attention never wavering from her. By the third dance, her feet were beginning to ache, and her face hurt from maintaining her pleasant mask, and she realized with growing despair that Edmund had effectively monopolized her entire card, his name scrawled across every line in his bold, aggressive hand, a territorial display that announced to every man in the room that Georgiana Fairfax was already claimed. She caught whispers behind fans as she passed, pitying glances from older matrons who had once been fond of her mother, speculative looks from younger ladies who were relieved not to be in her position, and through it all she held her head high and pretended not to care that her future was being decided by financial necessity, rather than anything resembling affection or respect. The supper interval brought temporary reprieve, and she found herself seated at Edmund's side at one of the small tables arranged in the supper room, where ice sculptures slowly melted between champagne fountains and elaborate displays of delicacies that made her stomach turn because she knew she could not eat a bite past the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in her throat. Edmund held court at their table, regaling his companions with a story about a business rival he had bested, and then quite suddenly he turned to her, and in a voice loud enough to carry to the neighbouring tables, announced that he intended to call on Lord Fairfax the following morning to formalize certain arrangements. "I shall speak to Lord Fairfax tomorrow," he declared with the satisfaction of a man making a magnanimous gesture. "Miss Fairfax has been bred for this role, and she understands her duty. Don't you, my dear?" It was not really a question, and every eye at their table and several nearby turned to her, waiting for her response, and Georgiana felt something crack inside her chest, even as she maintained her composure and replied in a voice that sounded distant to her own ears. "I understand what is expected of me, Lord Whitmore." His smile widened with triumph, and he patted her hand as one might pat a particularly obedient dog, and she had to look away before the tears burning behind her eyes could escape and humiliate her further, her gaze finding without conscious direction the far corner where the Duke of Ashford sat alone at a small table, his untouched plate before him, and his eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read, but that made her breath catch. The rest of supper passed in a blur of forced conversation, and the growing awareness that she was being discussed, dissected, her fate decided in the whispers that followed Edmund's announcement. And when they returned to the ballroom for the final set of dances, she moved like a woman in a dream, disconnected from her own body, watching herself perform the steps with mechanical precision. The orchestra struck up the final waltz, and Georgiana felt a sudden wild hope that perhaps she might sit this one out, claim fatigue or the heat, anything for a moment alone to compose herself before the carriage ride home, where her father would ask with anxious hopefulness if Edmund had spoken to her, and she would have to confirm that, yes, tomorrow their lives would change irrevocably. Then she saw the Duke of Ashford moving through the crowd toward her, his expression determined, and her heart began to race with something that felt dangerously like hope as he drew near and made a slight bow in her direction. "Miss Fairfax, might I?" he began, his voice deeper than she had imagined, cultured and precise. But Edmund stepped smoothly between them, his body language aggressively territorial as he smiled at the Duke with cold politeness. "The Duke of Ashford? How unexpected," Edmund said, his hand possessive on Georgiana's elbow. "I'm afraid my intended's card is quite full. Perhaps next season you'll be quicker, though I hear you don't dance." The insult was subtle, but unmistakable, and Georgiana watched the Duke's expression shudder, all emotion draining from his face until he was once again the cold aristocrat of reputation. And when his eyes met hers, she saw something there that made her chest ache, a flash of fury and frustration, and something else she could not name before it disappeared behind perfect control. "I don't," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving Georgiana's face. "Usually." The word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning she could not quite grasp, and then he turned slightly to address her directly as Edmund's grip on her arm tightened. "Good evening, Miss Fairfax," the Duke said, his voice gentle in a way that made tears prick her eyes again. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Then he turned and walked away, his tall figure cutting through the crowd with unconscious authority, and Georgiana watched him go with the terrible certainty that she had just lost something precious she had never even known she wanted. Edmund led her onto the floor for the final waltz, smug with victory, and as they moved through the familiar steps, Georgiana felt the last of her hope drain away, leaving only the hollow resignation of a woman who had just watched her future close around her like a gilded cage. The ballroom had grown oppressively hot, the combined warmth of 400 bodies and thousands of candles making the air thick and hard to breathe, and through the tall windows she could see that the promised storm had arrived, rain beginning to patter against the glass in a rhythm that matched the ache in her chest. By the time the music ended and Edmund finally released her to her father's care, Georgiana felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with dancing and everything to do with the weight of duty and expectation that pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. The Duke of Ashford was nowhere to be seen as they made their way to the entrance hall to wait for their carriage, and she told herself it did not matter, that a man like that would never have seriously considered a woman in her position anyway, that the moment of connection she had felt was nothing but her own desperate imagination conjuring romance where there was only pity. The rain had intensified by the time their carriage arrived, drumming on the roof as they settled inside for the short ride home, and Lord Fairfax smiled at her in the darkness with relief and gratitude that made her want to weep. "Lord Whitmore seems very pleased," her father said gently. "You have done well tonight, my dear." Georgiana nodded because she could not trust her voice, and as the carriage rolled through the wet London streets, she pressed her forehead against the cool glass and watched the blurred lights pass by, trying not to think about grey eyes that had seen her with uncomfortable clarity, or the way her heart had raced when the Duke of Ashford had said her name, because none of that mattered now. Tomorrow Edmund would call on her father, arrangements would be made, contracts would be signed, and she would become what she had always been destined to be, a solution to a financial problem, a woman whose worth was measured in pounds and social connections rather than in dreams or desires or anything resembling love. But for now, in the privacy of the dark carriage with rain obscuring the world outside, she allowed herself one moment of grief for the life she would never have, the choice she had never been given, before she straightened her spine and prepared to face the future that duty demanded, little knowing that across London in his Mayfair townhouse, Sebastian Wentworth, Duke of Ashford, sat in his study with a glass of untouched brandy and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The morning light filtering through the study windows held none of the promise that spring mornings should carry, and Georgiana sat rigidly in the chair her father had indicated, her hands folded in her lap, with the precise deportment that years of training had made automatic, while Lord Fairfax paced behind his desk with an energy she had not seen in months, his face animated with relief that made her heart sink even as she tried to feel grateful that at least one of them would find happiness in the arrangement being finalized today. Edmund was expected within the hour. His note had arrived with breakfast announcing his intention to call on Lord Fairfax regarding a matter of mutual interest and benefit, the phrasing so coldly transactional that Georgiana had set down her tea untouched and excused herself from the breakfast table before her father could see the despair she could no longer quite hide. The study smelled of pipe tobacco and old leather, familiar scents from childhood when she would sit on the floor while her father worked and her mother read aloud from whatever novel had captured her fancy. But those days felt impossibly distant now, separated from the present by her mother's death and her father's poor investments and the slow erosion of everything that had once felt secure. Lord Fairfax was saying something about settlements and arrangements, his voice bright with the forced optimism of a man trying to convince himself that selling his daughter to save his estate was a reasonable solution rather than a tragedy, and Georgiana made appropriate sounds of acknowledgement while her mind drifted to the memory of grey eyes watching her across a crowded ballroom, the Duke of Ashford's intensity as he had tried to claim that final dance, the flash of something almost like pain when Edmund had dismissed him with casual cruelty. She told herself to stop thinking about it, that the Duke's momentary interest had been nothing but pity or perhaps idle curiosity, that men of his station did not seriously consider women whose families were teetering on the edge of ruin, and yet she could not shake the feeling that something significant had passed between them in those few seconds before Edmund had intervened, some recognition that she had no words to describe and no right to indulge. A sharp knock at the study door made them both start, and Lord Fairfax straightened his waistcoat with visible pleasure, assuming Edmund had arrived early in his eagerness to formalize their agreement, but instead the footman who entered looked distinctly flustered as he announced that the Duke of Ashford was here and requesting an immediate audience with Lord Fairfax on a matter of utmost urgency. The silence that followed this pronouncement was so complete that Georgiana could hear the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sounds of horses on the street outside, and she felt her heart begin to race with a mixture of confusion and something dangerously close to hope that she tried desperately to suppress, because hope, in her position, was a cruelty she could not afford. Lord Fairfax recovered first, his expression shifting from surprise to uncertainty to careful calculation as he instructed the footman to show the Duke in immediately, and Georgiana barely had time to stand and smooth her morning dress of pale green muslin before Sebastian Wentworth entered the study with the controlled power of a man who had spent the night making decisions and was now here to execute them with military precision. He was even more imposing in the morning light than he had been in the candle-lit ballroom, his dark hair slightly dishevelled as though he had been running his hands through it, his cravat tied with less than his usual perfection, suggesting he had dressed in haste, and there was something in his eyes as they found hers that made her breath catch, an intensity that spoke of determination and something else she was afraid to name. "Your Grace?" Lord Fairfax stammered, clearly thrown by this unprecedented visit. "This is most unexpected. Please, sit, may I offer you refreshment? I confess I cannot imagine what matter brings you to call at such an early hour." Sebastian remained standing, his attention shifting to Lord Fairfax with the focused courtesy of a man who had something important to say, and intended to say it without the usual social niceties that normally governed such interactions. "Lord Fairfax, I apologize for the intrusion and the unconventional hour, but I have a proposition that I believe requires immediate discussion before certain other arrangements are finalized." He glanced at Georgiana again, something almost like apology in his expression, before continuing with a directness that was both shocking and strangely refreshing after years of navigating society's endless indirection. "I am prepared to settle £50,000 immediately, with an additional £20,000 upon conclusion of the season, in exchange for exclusive rights to every dance on Miss Fairfax's card for the remainder of the social calendar." The words hung in the air like something solid, and Georgiana felt the room tilt slightly as she struggled to process what she had just heard, while her father made a strangled sound that might have been surprise or confusion, or both. Sebastian continued speaking with the same calm precision, as though he were discussing a business contract rather than something utterly unprecedented in the history of London society. "Every ball, every musical, every social engagement where Miss Fairfax might be expected to dance, she dances only with me, or sits out entirely. The arrangement would continue through the end of the season, at which point both parties would be free to dissolve it with no further obligation." Lord Fairfax had gone pale and then flushed, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as he stared at the Duke with an expression caught between shock and desperate hope, because £70,000 would not only erase their debts but restore their fortune to something approaching its former stability, and Georgiana watched her father's face and saw the moment temptation won over propriety. "Your Grace, this is—" "I have never heard of such an arrangement," Lord Fairfax managed, his voice unsteady. "What are your intentions toward my daughter?" The question was reasonable, the concern of any father faced with such an irregular proposal, but Sebastian's answer was not what either of them expected. To give her what every woman deserves and few receive, a choice. He turned to look directly at Georgiana as he spoke, his grey eyes holding hers with an honesty that was almost painful in its nakedness. "I would like to speak with Miss Fairfax privately, if I may, before any decisions are made. She must agree to this arrangement willingly, or I withdraw the offer entirely." Lord Fairfax looked between them, clearly torn between the impropriety of leaving them unchaperoned and the desperate need to secure an agreement that would save them from ruin. And finally he nodded slowly and excused himself with instructions that they might use the library, that he would wait in the drawing-room, his voice trailing off as he left, as though he could not quite believe what was happening. Sebastian waited until the door closed behind Lord Fairfax before gesturing for Georgiana to precede him to the library, and she moved in a daze through the familiar hallways of her home that suddenly felt strange and dreamlike, her mind spinning with questions and suspicions and a wild fluttering in her chest that might have been panic or excitement or some combination of both. The library was her favorite room in the house, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books that had been her companions through her mother's death and her father's withdrawal, though now there were gaps where volumes had been sold to collectors, empty spaces that spoke eloquently of their changed circumstances. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the small garden, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air, and the intimacy of the space, just the two of them alone with the door closed, felt simultaneously dangerous and thrilling in ways that made Georgiana acutely aware of her racing pulse. She turned to face him, drawing on reserves of composure she had not known she possessed, and lifted her chin with the pride of a woman who had been humiliated enough and would not suffer it again without protest. "So I am to be traded from one man's possession to another's," she said, her voice trembling slightly with anger she could no longer contain. "How is this different from Lord Whitmore's presumption?" Sebastian flinched as though she had struck him, and for a moment his careful control slipped enough that she saw genuine pain cross his features before he mastered it and stepped closer, though still maintaining a respectful distance that somehow made his intensity more affecting rather than less. Because you can say no, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. Right now. Say no, and I will leave and never speak of this again. Your father need never know this conversation happened. I will tell him you found the arrangement insulting and I withdrew the offer. You can accept Whitmore's suit or find another match or do whatever you choose, but it will be your choice, not mine. Georgiana stared at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery or cruelty, and finding only earnest sincerity that disarmed her anger and left her floundering in confusion. And if I say yes? She asked after a long pause during which she was intensely aware of the sound of her own breathing. What happens at the end of the season? Whatever you wish, Sebastian replied, his eyes never leaving hers. I make no claims on you beyond the dances I have paid for. If at the end of the season you decide you prefer Whitmore or another suitor, you are free to accept them. If you decide you prefer to remain unmarried, that is also your right. I will not use this arrangement to manipulate or coerce you into anything beyond what we explicitly agree to now. It was too much, too unprecedented, and Georgiana felt her defenses crumbling under the weight of his directness, even as her pride bristled at the fundamental transaction underlying his offer. Men always want something, Your Grace, she said, the words coming out more bitter than she had intended. What do you really want from this arrangement? Sebastian was silent for a long moment, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to lean slightly forward to hear him clearly. Yes, he said. I want to see you smile without that look of resignation you wore last night. I watched that man treat you like chattel, like a possession he had already acquired, and I saw something die in your eyes with each dance, each proprietary touch, each word that reminded you that your worth was being measured in pounds rather than in the qualities that actually matter. I want to give you time and freedom to choose your own path, even if that path does not include me. I will pay any price for that, even if the smile I am hoping to see is never directed at me. The raw honesty of his words stole her breath, and she had to look away from the naked vulnerability in his expression, her mind racing through the implications of what he was offering. It was still a transaction, still money exchanged for her company, but he was right that there was a crucial difference. He was offering her choice rather than demanding compliance, and she could walk away at the end with no obligation beyond what she willingly gave. She thought of Edmund's presumptuous announcement at supper, his hand on her arm like a brand of ownership, the way he had dismissed the Duke's attempt to claim a dance, as though Georgiana had no say in the matter, and she felt anger kindle again in her chest, not at Sebastian, but at the entire system that had brought her to this moment where her choices were limited to which man's offer she would accept. I need to understand something, she said finally, turning back to face him with her arms wrapped around herself, as though she could hold in the confusion and fear and desperate hope that threatened to overwhelm her. Why? Why me? Why this? Why now? You could have any woman in London. You have rejected every debutante for 7 years, and now you suddenly decide to make this unprecedented offer to a woman you have never even been properly introduced to. What am I missing? Sebastian moved to the window, staring out at the garden as though the answer might be written in the carefully tended flower beds, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of truths he had clearly not intended to share, but found himself compelled to voice anyway. I spent 7 years avoiding marriage because I watched my father destroy my mother through the gradual erosion of her spirit, he said quietly. He married her for her fortune and treated her with cold courtesy that was somehow worse than cruelty might have been. She withered in that marriage, became a shadow of the vibrant woman she had been, and when she died I swore I would never trap another woman in such an arrangement. But last night I watched Whitmore treat you exactly as my father treated my mother, as a valuable acquisition rather than a person, and I saw in your eyes the same resignation my mother wore, and something in me simply could not allow it to happen again without at least trying to intervene." He turned back to face her, his expression raw with emotion. "I have no grand plan, Miss Fairfax. I do not know what I am doing beyond knowing that I could not wake up this morning and let you accept Whitmore's suit without offering you an alternative. Perhaps in 3 months you will decide that a marriage of convenience to him is preferable to whatever this arrangement might become. That is your right, but at least it will be a choice you make freely rather than one forced on you by circumstance." Georgiana felt tears prick her eyes at the painful honesty in his words. This powerful duke who could have anything he wanted, admitting that he was acting on impulse and emotion rather than calculated strategy. And she realized that he was taking as much of a risk as she was, perhaps more, because he was violating every rule he had set for himself in order to offer her freedom. The silence stretched between them, weighted with possibility and danger in equal measure, and she knew that whatever she decided in this moment would alter the course of her life irrevocably. "If I agree," she said slowly, testing each word before she spoke it, "I want your promise that at the end of the season I am truly free to choose. No manipulation, no pressure, no using my father's gratitude or my own sense of obligation to coerce me into a match I do not want." Sebastian crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his obvious intensity. "You have my word as a gentleman and as a duke," he said firmly. "At the end of the season, you are free to choose whatever and whomever you wish. I will accept your decision without protest or interference." She searched his face one more time, looking for any sign of deception and finding only earnest sincerity that made her chest ache with something she was afraid to examine too closely. "Very well," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I accept your offer, Your Grace." Something shifted in Sebastian's expression, relief and triumph, and something else that made her pulse quicken, but he simply bowed over her hands with perfect courtesy and said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Fairfax. I promise you will not regret this." They returned to the study where Lord Fairfax waited with barely concealed anxiety, and Sebastian laid out the terms with business-like efficiency, the immediate settlement, the additional payment at season's end, the exclusive arrangement regarding all social dancing, the freedom for both parties to withdraw at the conclusion without further obligation. Lord Fairfax listened with an expression that cycled through shock and hope and disbelief, and when Sebastian asked if the terms were acceptable, her father nodded slowly, his eyes finding Georgiana's, with a question she answered with a small nod of her own. The Duke produced papers already drawn up by his solicitors, evidence that he had spent the entire night not sleeping but planning this intervention with meticulous care, and within an hour the agreements were signed, and Sebastian was taking his leave with a promise to call the following day to discuss their first social engagement together. After he left, Georgiana stood at the study window and watched his carriage roll away down the street, and tried to ignore the fact that her hands were shaking and her heart was racing, and nothing in her carefully ordered world made sense anymore. Lord Fairfax came to stand beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Are you quite certain about this, my dear?" he asked quietly. "It is most irregular, and I would not have you feel pressured into an arrangement that makes you uncomfortable, even if the financial relief is considerable." Georgiana turned to him with a small smile that felt more genuine than any expression she had managed in months. "I am certain, Papa," she said. "For the first time in a very long time, I am choosing something for myself rather than accepting what circumstances dictate. That alone makes it worthwhile, whatever comes of it." Within hours the news had spread through London society with the speed of wildfire, servants gossiping to servants, morning callers noting the Duke of Ashford's early visit to the Fairfax residence, and by afternoon the drawing-rooms of Mayfair were buzzing with speculation about The unprecedented arrangement between the cold duke and the impoverished beauty he had apparently decided to claim for himself. The gossips dissected every possible interpretation, some calling it romantic, others scandalous. Many convinced that Georgiana must be the duke's mistress in all but name, and that the dancing arrangement was merely a convenient fiction to maintain appearances. Georgiana heard none of it yet, sequestered in her room where she sat at her writing desk and tried to compose a letter to her aunt in the country explaining what had transpired. But the words would not come because she herself did not fully understand what had happened, or what it meant, or why her heart felt lighter than it had in years, despite the scandal she knew was brewing. Outside her window, London carried on with its usual business, carriages rolling past, vendors calling their wares, the city humming with life and gossip, and the endless social machinations that governed their world. And somewhere across the city, Sebastian Wentworth sat in his study and stared at the signed agreement on his desk, and wondered what madness had possessed him to do something so completely contrary to every principle he had lived by for the past 7 years, knowing only that when he had watched Georgiana Fairfax's eyes dim with resignation at Lady Hertford's ball, he had felt something crack open inside his chest that he had thought permanently sealed, and that he would pay any price, face any scandal, risk any consequence to see her smile without that terrible look of defeat that had haunted him through the sleepless night. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The 3 days between Sebastian's unprecedented offer and their first public appearance together had passed in a blur of anxious preparation and mounting dread. And now Georgiana stood in her dressing room while her maid fastened the final hooks of her gown, a creation of midnight blue silk that her father had insisted on purchasing despite her protests, saying that if she was to be the subject of London's gossip, she would at least look magnificent while enduring it. And she had to admit, as she studied her reflection, that the deep blue brought out the amber in her eyes and made her skin glow like cream against the rich fabric. The whispers had already begun, of course, spreading through drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs with vicious speed, some calling the arrangement romantic in that breathless way people spoke of fairy tales, others declaring it the height of scandal, and more than a few convinced with absolute certainty that Georgiana had become the Duke of Ashford's mistress, and the dancing arrangement was merely a convenient fiction to allow them to appear together publicly without completely destroying what remained of her reputation. She had heard it all from well-meaning friends who called to express concern, and from her father's business associates who could not quite hide their speculation behind polite congratulations. And with each retelling she had felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders until she could barely breathe under the scrutiny of a society that had once ignored her and now watched her every move with rabid fascination. Sebastian's carriage arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, and Georgiana descended the stairs with her heart hammering against her ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the physical exertion and everything to do with the knowledge that tonight would either validate her choice or prove it the worst mistake of her life. He was waiting in the entrance hall, immaculate in black evening clothes that emphasized his height and the breadth of his shoulders, and when he looked up at her approach, something flickered in his grey eyes that made her breath catch, an expression too quickly masked but unmistakably appreciative, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks at the intensity of his gaze. "You look beautiful," he said simply, the words quiet enough that only she could hear, and there was nothing practiced or artificial in the compliment, just a statement of fact delivered with the same directness that characterized everything about him. She murmured her thanks and accepted his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fine fabric of his coat, and as they walked to the waiting carriage, she was acutely aware of the neighbors' curtains twitching, the whispers that would follow this departure, the fact that her life had become a spectacle for others to dissect and judge. The Duchess of Somerset's estate in Kensington was even grander than Lady Hertford's Belgravia mansion, its massive stone facade lit by hundreds of lanterns that transformed the formal gardens into something from a dream. And as their carriage rolled up the long drive, Georgiana could see other arrivals. A river of silk and jewels flowing toward the entrance, and she felt her anxiety spike to near panic. "I can feel them all watching," she whispered as they descended from the carriage and joined the stream of guests, her hand tightening on Sebastian's arm. This was a terrible idea. "Then let them watch," he replied calmly, covering her hand with his own in a gesture that was both reassuring and possessive. "They will see a beautiful woman dancing with the luckiest man in London." She looked up at him sharply, searching his face for mockery and finding only steady sincerity. "You do not believe that?" she said, half statement and half question. "Do I not?" he countered, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "I am the only man here who gets to dance with you. Seems fortunate to me." The entrance hall was a soaring space of marble and gold, and the moment they appeared together the whispers began, a susurrus of sound that followed them like a wake as they made their way toward the ballroom. Georgiana kept her chin high and her expression serene, drawing on years of training that had taught her to mask her true feelings behind a pleasant facade. But inside, she felt exposed and vulnerable in a way that made her want to flee back to the safety of her father's house. The ballroom itself was breathtaking, its domed ceiling painted with classical scenes of gods and heroes, the walls hung with silk in shades of cream and gold, and chandeliers so massive they seemed to hold entire constellations of candles that cast dancing light across the crowd of at least 500 guests, more than she had ever seen gathered in one place. She spotted familiar faces, Lady Caroline looking sympathetic from across the room, several of her father's friends nodding politely, but their wives turning away with expressions of disapproval, and there against the far wall stood Edmund Whitmore, his face a mask of cold fury as he watched them enter, and Georgiana felt a chill run down her spine at the naked hatred in his eyes. Sebastian must have felt her tense because his hand covered hers again briefly. "Ignore him," he murmured. "He has no claim on you, and no right to his anger." The orchestra was already playing, couples whirling across the polished floor in a waltz that made Georgiana's stomach clench with nerves, because dancing with Sebastian in a crowded ballroom where every eye would be upon them was entirely different from the abstract idea of dancing she had agreed to in her father's library. Sebastian led her toward the floor with unhurried confidence, and as they took their positions, she was suddenly terrified that she would stumble, that her feet would not remember the steps, that she would humiliate both of them in front of the entire ton. "Look at me," Sebastian said quietly, his hand settling at her waist with firm gentleness. "Pretend we are the only two people here." She met his eyes and found herself anchored by the steadiness she saw there, and then the music swelled and they were moving, and she discovered that Sebastian Wentworth was an exquisite dancer, guiding her through the turns with such skill that she felt weightless, her feet following his lead without conscious thought as they swept across the floor. The whispers faded into background noise as she focused on his face, the strong lines of jaw and cheekbone, the grey eyes that held hers with unwavering attention. And gradually, she felt her terror transforming into something else, something almost like exhilaration as they moved together in perfect synchronization. "You dance beautifully," she said, surprised into honesty. I had not expected such grace from a man with a reputation for avoiding ballrooms. "I had excellent tutors," he replied, and then, after a pause, added with the hint of a smile, "And I find I am highly motivated to make a good impression on my partner this evening." Despite everything, despite the watching crowd and the weight of scandal and her own uncertainty about what she had agreed to, Georgiana felt a laugh bubble up in her chest and escape before she could contain it, and Sebastian's eyes brightened at the sound. "There," he said softly. "That is what I wanted to see." They completed the waltz, and he led her from the floor, and immediately claimed her hand for the next dance, a country reel that required less conversation but more concentration on the patterns. And through it all, Georgiana was intensely aware of the scrutiny they were under, the fans fluttering with whispered speculation, the way other dancers gave them slightly more space than was strictly necessary, as though scandal might be contagious. By their third dance together, another waltz, she had relaxed enough to feel bold. "Why have you never married?" she asked abruptly, deciding that if she was going to be the subject of gossip, she might as well use this arrangement to satisfy her own curiosity. "And do not deflect. You bought the right to my time. I am spending it however I choose.